Today we conclude our study of the saga of Abraham and Sarah with a tale that is difficult in our country to understand. And the main reason for this is the story we heard this morning is not something we traditionally do. How many of you are in an arranged marriage? Why are you laughing? Not on my life, okay. Well, but it's something that we don't do in this country, right? But there are countries throughout the world that still do this. They arrange marriages for political advancement or for financial advancement, right? So that it makes this story hard for us to kind of comprehend and put into our own perspectives. We just don't understand what it means to have an arranged marriage. But in the ancient Middle East, this was something that was done nearly every single marriage. That being said, the story of the search for and the discovery of a bride for Isaac, the son of Abraham and Sarah, is one of the most fascinating stories I think we can discover together. It is perhaps not only the earliest recorded account of an arranged marriage, but it's also a touching account of how God providentially brought Isaac and Rebekah together for one of the greatest love stories that we have in our Bibles. But before we talk a lot about that, I want to explore a more contemporary account of how God and marriage changed the course of history. These two stories that I'm going to share with you today are vastly different. They are, and therein lies some of the important lessons to learn from them, but they are both equally powerful. Just about 54 years ago, on September 5th, 1972, the worst tragedy in Olympic history jolted the world. Some of you might remember this. How many of you remember the Summer Olympics of 1972? Do you guys remember what happened there? Munich. Yeah. So in 1970, for those of us that aren't familiar with this story, in 1972, at the Summer Olympics, terrorists wearing workout sweats scaled the walls of the Olympic Village, broke into one of the team apartments, seized 9 Israeli athletes after killing their wrestling coach and a weightlifter. The terrorists from a group called Black September demanded the release of their comrades in prison, but their main intent involved bringing the plight of the Palestinians to light, and in particular, the leader Yasser Arafat to the forefront of international attention. And it worked. Right? They succeeded in that. Although their comrades were not released from prison, Black September forced the world to take notice of the Palestinian grievances against Israel. Arafat was eventually invited to address the UN General Assembly. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, better known as the PLO, were granted United Nations Special Observer status. And suddenly, with their objectives met and a worldwide platform secured, Arafat and the PLO had a problem. The young men that they sent in to take care of this particular terroristic event were no longer needed. They no longer needed a band of bloodthirsty fighters eagerly willing to die for their cause. And so their challenge was, what were they going to do with these young men who were all trained specifically for the task of doing terroristic attacks? And in an attempt to reorganize and temper the PLO terrorists, Arafat ordered his intelligence officer, Abu Yad, to turn Black September off. You can't just do that, right? These are young men who are trained to kill and only kill. The problem is that how do you transform these terrorists from being killing machines, hungry for more killing, into upstanding citizens? Abu Iyad passed this arduous assignment on to one of his deputies, and that unnamed man came up with an ingenious plan. What happened next sounds like a remake of the classic movie 7 Brides for 7 Daughters. You guys familiar with that movie? Has anybody ever seen it? Okay, a few of you, good. At least some of you will understand what I'm talking about. The intelligence chief that Arafat assigned this duty and his deputy brainstormed all the possibilities that they could come up with in this ridiculous idea. And they came up with this idea of why not marrying off all of the terrorists? Why not counter vile, spitting hate into heart-softening love? Why not give these men, the fiercest fighters in the world, a reason to live rather than a reason to die? And just maybe it might work. All of their other alternatives seemed even riskier and harder to do. And so that's what they set about doing. They traveled to refugee camps, to PLO strongholds, to neighbors in all the major Middle Eastern cities in search of the most attractive, available young Palestinian women that they could find, offering them a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to serve their country. How many of you are familiar with the Middle East? A couple of you. Do women have any status in the Middle East? No. Rarely, very rarely. Do women have any authority in the Middle East? No. These women are given an amazing opportunity. They have a lifetime opportunity to serve their country the way the men did. And without disclosing any of the details, the women were asked to accept this mission carte blanche, without any knowledge of what was going on. But they were being asked to accept the mission sanctioned by the man who was most famous for saving the Palestinians, Yasser Arafat. And they couldn't refuse. I mean, who could refuse a call to become a true patriot? So, this band of men went out and found about 100 lovely young women who agreed to accept and were fetched from their homes across the expanse of the Middle East, brought to Beirut, where they attended what can only be described as a PLO version of a college mixer. Okay, it's a really serious story. Did you expect me not to throw in some humor? A little mingling, some soft music, a few flirty looks from across the hall or across the dance floor, and suddenly there were romances blooming. And these evolved into long-term commitments. The incentives to marry were hard to resist. I'm going to put this in perspective for you. Each young Black September member and his blushing bride would receive $3,000, plus bonus gifts, including a nonviolent job with the PLO, an apartment in Beirut, equipped with a gas stove, refrigerator, and television. For those of you who've been in the Middle East, that's living in luxury. Each couple adding a baby to the family within a year would be granted another $5,000. Not bad for a band of trained assassins who were used to living in tents. And I can tell you from my own personal experience 15 years ago, this would have been a fortune for these young couples who received these monies. To put it in perspective, most Palestinians, based upon best guesses and estimates, because data was not kept at the time, most Palestinians earned $600 a year in 1972. These couples were given $8,000, which, putting it into even further perspective, would have received a total of just shy of $34,000. These folks would have been rich. They would have been part of the elite. Now, who among us would not have accepted those offers, right? 600 versus 34,000? Yeah, I might think about it. And it should be no surprise that every single member of Black September accepted the challenge. They found Ms. Right, they got married, and nearly every single one of them had a child within a year. No surprise when you think about it in terms of finances. But what about that ingrained thirst for blood and their need for battle and fighting? The intelligence chief and the future brigadier general instituted a plan to test these former terrorists just to see how their plan was coming about and whether it was actually working. So occasionally these men were given assignments around the world, in Geneva or Paris, with genuine passports and some non-violent duties to take on. And without exception, the men refused every single assignment. You see, They now had a purpose. They had a wife and a family to think of, not just themselves. Fearing arrest for their past crimes, these men had too much to lose. And so the moral of this story is that while hate terrorizes, love has a tendency to tenderize us, even the most hardened heart. This is a classic account of how marriage is often seen as an institution that will socialize a young man and settle him down. Now, how many of us have never heard that before? Right? If wildness and irresponsibility are the disease, marriage and love is the cure. But it's not that case in our second story, and this is where the contradiction happens. This story, being much older than the first one, begins with the father of both Muslim and Jew, the man we now know as Abraham. And as we learned over the last few weeks, Abraham and Sarah will do just about anything to ensure their future. They're no different than most motivated people today, right? I mean, they're willing to take care of things and do what they need to do. But at this point in their story, Abraham is getting close to the end of his life. And so he realizes that he is not going to be around much longer and that his son Isaac needed a wife to take care of him. I mean, Sarah had abandoned a prosperous life in Haran in order to follow Abraham to places unknown after God placed the call upon both of them. They traveled across the Fertile Crescent together and down through the Negev and finally back up to Hebron, where Sarah died at the ripe old age of 125. Unfortunately, Isaac was broken, and he seemed very broken after the death of his mother, who had given birth to him when she was 90. So, Isaac's only about 35 years old. He still hasn't married. In that day and age, shall I say he would have been considered a spinster? Really, he was old by that standard. And Abraham knew in his heart that the best cure for Isaac and the only way to ensure that Abraham would fulfill the promise that God had made to him to ensure a lifeline of descendants greater than he could count, he needed to take matters into his own hand. And so we have the story today of him sending one of his servants off to find a wife for his elderly son Isaac. But Isaac also needed a reason to live, and that's where the comparison and the similarities to our first story come in. By giving him a reason to live, Abraham knew Isaac would be able to carry on. And so as we heard, Abraham sent his unnamed servant. No, he doesn't have a name. You always ask what his name is. But he sent the servant out to fetch a wife. And the instructions for locating Ms. Right indicated some travel, because no Canaanite woman would do as Abraham's future daughter-in-law. And just as Arafat's servants searched in Palestine camps for proper wives, Abraham's servant ventured back home to Haran, specifically to the local hotspot where young women regularly ventured, the local village watering hole. Literally, it's a watering hole. I'm not talking about a bar here, guys. It's literally a watering hole. It's a well. So get the bar image out of your minds. This servant's assignment was carried out prayerfully. In fact, what story we heard today was him laying eyes on a winsome Rebecca while in the middle of a conversation with God. And we pick up that play-by-play as it happened. And so imagine the servant kneeling by the well as he prays, God of my master Abraham, grant me success today. Show steadfast love to my master Abraham. I am sitting here by the spring of water, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. Let the girl to whom I say, offer your jar that I may drink, and who will say in return, drink, and I will water your camels. Let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. And in the midst of this prayer, Rebecca shows up, said all the right words, offered the stranger a place to sleep that night, and then ran home to tell the folks she's wearing some new jewelry. a newly acquired nose ring, and bracelets on her arms, which were often given as symbols of engagement. Okay, so I got to ask the question at this point. Guys, if somebody came back to you and said, hey, I found a wife for you, here she is, and you're already engaged before you even meet her, how would you feel? Again, it's a foreign concept for us in this country, but that's essentially what's happening here. And like the brides in our other story, Rebecca knew very few details. And yet she runs home excited to tell her folks, I'm engaged. Now, this deal offered her a husband plus a few signing bonuses like sheep and slaves and a place to live and a future. But she could not have known that her acceptance would make her a crucial figure in God's plan. She had no idea that she would have twin sons, that the name of one of those sons would become Israel, and from that son there would be the 12 tribes who fulfill the promise God made to Abraham. She knew none of this, but the yes came anyway. Now, this chapter is one of the Bible's greatest love stories, but not so much because of the love for Rebekah and Isaac, because they had no idea who each other were. It is one of the greatest love stories because their marriage started with a blind date and became a lifelong commitment to one another. Some argue that the marriage itself left a lot to be desired, but it's a great story because it demonstrates God's abiding interest in our personal lives. God understands our needs and our desires. Isaac, sad, depressed, and in mourning over the loss of his beloved mother, without a life companion, was in desperate need of a reason to live. God gave that to him. In this story, as well in the story of our own lives, we see that God knows our needs before we even know what they are or are able to articulate them for ourselves. More importantly, God provides what we need when we need it, even when we cannot see it right in the moment. It also reminds us that no one stands beyond the sweep of God's providence. Man, woman, child, master, servant, husband, wife, son, or daughter. God takes care of God's own. In this case, God brought to Isaac the object of his love's affection. God's love, affection. Love is one of God's sweetest gifts. Yes? Yes. Grace reveals it in many ways. Yes? Yes. That wasn't so sure. Grace reveals love to us from God. Yes? Yes. Okay. In marriage, we discover God's design for two people who come together to be a part of each other's lives, supporting each other through whatever comes. Love overcomes when we are terrorized. Whether it's loneliness, sorrow, self-doubt, or bitter regret, love gives us a reason to live. It is love that created this life for us, yes? And so this story stands as a reminder that God's love never ends. And I pray that we feel that deep, abiding love in our hearts this day and each day that is to come. Amen?